Welcome everyone. Today we will learn how to create an Angular template-driven forms application using Bootstrap. So go to VS Code and create a new Angular application using the Angular CLI. Type ngN, define the name of the application, less inline styles, skip test, and select the defaults. For simplicity, open the containing folder, go to the Bootstrap documentation to add some CSS styles to the HTML form. So copy this command to install Bootstrap, pull up a new terminal and execute the command. Go to the documentation and add 2 lines for CSS and JavaScript. So let's copy this CSS link, go to the index.html and add the Bootstrap script into the body section. Go to the component HTML, remove the sample code. I will copy a simple form, set the application to see the HTML form with Bootstrap styles. This simple application contains a basic information section with first name, last name, email, phone, and another section with the street, city, state, and a home checkbox, and a notes text area, and finally a submit button. So go back to Visual Studio Code and create the data model to collect the data from the input elements. So into the app folder, create a new file called user.ts, declare an interface with name user, define all the fields for the data model, first name, last name, email, phone, the address, which will be an address interface, and finally the nodes field. So declare the interface for the address with a couple of fields, street address, city, state, and finally a home boolean value. That's it. Go to the component class and declare and initialize the user data model to bind this data model to the input elements. So declare an user and initialize as an empty object, import the user, let's initialize the address object as empty, import the forms module into the standard component to work with template-driven forms, and go to the HTML, bind each data model property to the input elements. So how to do that? Into the input element, we'll use the ngModel directive to create two-way binding. So for the first name will be user.firstname. Copy this ngModel directive into all the inputs. Let's implement a submit button to store the collected data from the HTML form. So how to do that? In the submit button, add a type attribute submit, and into the form section add an output event called ngSubmit, which will execute a method in the TypeScript file. In this case it will be save. We will pass the form reference to reset the form when we will store the data model. So how to add a reference to the form? Add a template variable called form and use the ngForm directive. Save the data model. We will use the local storage for demo purposes, but you can use any real HTTP API to store the data. So go to the TypeScript file and define the save method that receives the form as a parameter, which is of ngForm. Let's save or store the data in the local storage by defining a key and passing the user object. So we need to transform this object into a JSON string, so called JSON stringify function, and then we will reset the form by invoking the reset function. Go to the HTML. We also want to load data to fill the form, so we will use the local storage to load the data. So add a new button of type button as a secondary button called load data, add a click event to get the user data model and fill the form from the local storage API. Invoke the load method from the component class. Let's save it and declare the method. So the user, which is bound to the HTML form, will be local storage that get item by passing the key, which is user, and we'll transform this string into an user object. How to do that? Called JSON.parse function, and that's it. Let's test the application. Go to the HTML form, fill the form, the first name, the last name, any email, declare a phone, fill the address section, city, select a state, let's add a home address and leave the nodes as empty. Click submit. We will store the data into local storage and reset the form, and click load data to fill the form. So far so good. Finally, let's add some built-in validators to the HTML form. So scroll up and add the required built-in validator to the first name. Add a min length validator of 3 characters. We'll add a simple Bootstrap invalid class to show to the user that the field is invalid. So how to do that? Add a reference to this form control by defining a template variable and use the ngModel directive. The form control object includes properties to track the input's modeled state, such as invalid, torched, or dirty. So add a simple condition to add an invalid class from Bootstrap called class that is invalid. Let's apply this class when the first name for control is invalid and is dirty. Let's try it out, save it. As you can see, the Bootstrap invalid style is applied when the field is invalid. Let's apply some built-in validators to all the fields. So let me copy this part. The last name, it will be a required field. Rename the template variable as last name. For the email, we can use an email built-in validator. So let's add it. Replace the template variable name. Add a validator for the form required, but also add the max length validator of 15. Go to the address section, add required validator for the street address. Similarly for the city, and for the state, it will be required, but in this case, we will replace the dirty state as touched to validate this field. And finally, let's leave it the home and nodes fields as optional. Go to the submit button and we will disable this button when the form is invalid. So at the disable attribute, when the form is invalid, we have the template reference variable in the form section using the ngForm directive. Let's save it and test it out. Fill the first name. As you can see, the submit button is disabled, so fill the form with valid data. The last name, which is required, the email, which will contain a correct email, and the phone, which has a max length of 15. As you can see, I cannot type more than 15 characters. So far, so good. Let's fill the address, which is a required field. Similarly for the city, which is a required field. And the state, if I leave it as touch, you can see the invalid Bootstrap class is displayed. So select a state, click the home address and add a note into the text area. Press enter. Over the submit button, we save the data model into the local storage and we reset the form. So let's click load data. So far, so good. So in this demo, we learned how to create an Angular template-driven forms application using Bootstrap.